Imagine a quiet town where justice is supposed to be the foundation of everything. But what happens when those sworn to protect us betray that trust? In this story, we follow a boy named Elijah, a homeless teenager with nothing to his name but his courage, who stumbles upon a chilling secret late one night. A plot so sinister, it could destroy the life of the only man who ever showed him kindness. Elijah faces a choice no one his age should ever have to make: stay silent and safe, or risk everything to stop the unthinkable. How far would you go to do the right thing? Could you stand up to the people who hold all the power? What Elijah discovers and what he decides to do will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last moment. Stay with us to uncover a story of courage, justice, and second chances. But before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if today's story keeps you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to enjoy more emotional and inspiring stories. Now let's start this journey together. The sun beat down mercilessly on a cracked sidewalk outside a small, worn-down grocery store in the outskirts of Willowbrook, a town too familiar with struggle. The faint hum of traffic was broken by sharp voices, an argument that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Near the store in trance stood a thin, weary woman clutching a fraying canvas bag to her chest. Her face, lined with exhaustion and worry, was turned toward the ground. Beside her stod her teenage son, Elijah. At 17, Elijah was lean and wiry, his clothes 2 sizes too small and his sneakers scuffed beyond recognition. He stood stiff as a board, his hands clenched in fists at his sides, his face flushed with anger. A group of 3 uniformed officers had surrounded them like wolves circling prey. Officer Brandt, the leader of the group, loomed closer, his sunglasses perched low on his nose as he sneered. "You really expect us to believe that someone just gave you these groceries?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The woman swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I promise you, sir, a kind man outside the store. He gave them to us. We didn't steal anything." Her words were desperate, yet quiet, as if any volume might anger them further. Brandt chuckled darkly. "A likely story. Folks like you are always looking for a handout or looking to cheat the system." His words stung, venomous and cutting. Elijah's fist tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. "We didn't steal. You have no right to treat us like this." His voice shook, fueled by equal parts rage and helplessness. "Watch your tone, boy," one of the other officers barked, stepping forward. He was stocky and gruff, with a smirk that only fanned Elijah's anger. "You want to make this worse for yourselves?" Before Elijah could respond, Brandt shoved him lightly in the shoulder. "Tough guy, huh? What are you going to do?" he taunted. "You're nothing. A nobody." Elijah staggered back a step, his face burning with humiliation. His mother reached out, resting a hand on his arm, as if silently pleading for him not to fight back. "Don't, Elijah," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but her grip was steady. "You should listen to your mom, kid," Brandt sneered. For Elijah, time seemed to slow, the humiliation of standing there, powerless, under the officer's cruel gaze, felt unbearable. How could this be happening? What gave him the right to treat his mother, his family, this way? His anger boiled over, the heat of the sun seeming to feed it. He opened his mouth to shout back, but a commanding voice suddenly boomed across the parking lot. "That's enough." The officers froze, their taunts dying mid-sentence. All eyes turned toward a tall, broad-shouldered man striding purposefully toward them. His uniform was crisp, his posture confident, and his face set like stone. His badge glimmered under the sun. Captain Marcus Reyes, a veteran officer known across Willowbrook for his unwavering sense of justice. "What's going on here?" Captain Reyes asked sharply, his dark eyes locking onto Brandt and his team. Brandt straightened, his smirk faltering. "Captain, we caught these 2 suspicious characters outside the store. Figured we'd check them out." "Suspicious?" Reyes's voice was cold, his gaze hardening. "Because they were carrying groceries? Did you bother to check with the store manager? Or is intimidation the only tool you know how to use?" Brandt's face turned red, but he didn't answer. Reyes turned his attention to the woman and Elijah. His expression softened. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked gently. The woman nodded hesitantly, her eyes still wide with fear. "Yes, sir. We didn't do anything wrong." Reyes turned back to Brant and his men, his voice dropping to an icy edge. "You three, back to your patrols. Now." Brant hesitated, as if considering arguing, but the look in Reyes's eyes told him better. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, motioning for the others to follow him. As they retreated, their earlier arrogance evaporated, replaced by quiet muttering and glances cast over their shoulders. Captain Reyes waited until they were gone before turning back to Elijah and his mother. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said, his tone genuine. "You don't have to worry anymore." Elijah's fists finally relaxed, but his glare remained, smoldering with resentment. "They'll just do it to someone else," he muttered. "You stop them now, but what's going to stop them next time?" Reyes crouched slightly so he could look Elijah in the eye. "What's your name, son?" "Elijah," the boy replied, his voice clipped. "Elijah, listen to me. What happened here today isn't right. But there are better ways to fight back than letting your anger control you. Trust me when I say that revenge and rage solve nothing. You want to make a difference? Be better than those men. Rise above it." Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't. The anger still churned inside him. Though somewhere in the back of his mind, Reyes's words lingered. "Be better." Reyes glanced at the worn-out groceries the woman still clutched. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" The woman shook her head slightly, shame flickering across her face. "We've been staying at the shelter downtown." "Let me drive you," Reyes offered. "It's the least I can do." Elijah's mother hesitated, then nodded gratefully. As they walked toward Reyes's patrol car, Elijah stole a glance back at the spot where the officers had stood, mocking them. His jaw clenched, his anger far from gone. But as Captain Reyes opened the car door and spoke kindly to his mother, Elijah couldn't help but feel something else, too. A small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't entirely out of reach. The patrol car's engine hummed quietly as Captain Marcus Reyes pulled out of the parking lot, the heat of the afternoon sun giving way to the faint, cooling breeze of early evening. In the rearview mirror, he could see Elijah and his mother, Naomi, sitting in the back seat, silent and tense. The grocery bag rested carefully in Naomi's lap, her fingers clutching it as though it were the last fragile piece of dignity she had left to hold on to. Captain Reyes broke the silence first. "The shelter's not far from here. It's a good place, clean, safe. They'll take care of you for tonight." Naomi murmured a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely above a whisper. She stared out the window, her expression one of quiet exhaustion. Elijah, however, sat rigid, his face turned toward the opposite window. His fists rested against his knees, his jaw clenched tight, as though he were trying to hold back the flood of words he wanted to unleash. The afternoon's humiliation burned in his memory, and he could still see the smug sneers on those officers' faces. His reflection in the glass only made him angrier. He hated how helpless he felt. "You live here long?" Captain Reyes asked, his voice soft but conversational. Naomi turned from the window, shaking her head. "No, sir. Not long. We've been moving around a lot." Since she hesitated, swallowing hard. "Since I lost my job." Captain Reyes glanced at her through the mirror, his brows furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. What kind of work did you do?" "I was a seamstress," Naomi replied, her voice steadier now. "I worked for a small tailor shop out of town. Then the business shut down, and things," she sighed, her voice trailing off. "Well, they got hard." Reyes nodded, his eyes focused on the road. He'd heard stories like hers before. Good people, hard-working people, whose lives unraveled after one misstep or misfortune. It was far too easy to fall through the cracks of society, and far too few extended a helping hand. "And what about you, Elijah?" Reyes asked, his tone more upbeat, as though trying to draw the boy into the conversation. "You in school?" Elijah turned sharply from the window, his eyes meeting Reyes's in the mirror with an unflinching glare. "Does it look like I'm in school?" he snapped. "Elijah!" Naomi scolded softly, reaching over to touch her son's arm. Reyes held up a calming hand. "It's okay," he said, keeping his tone patient. It's a fair question. He shifted his focus back to Elijah. You're smart, I can see that. You got a fire in you. Kid, what do you want to do with that? Elijah's glare didn't falter, but his silence stretched longer than he'd intended. Finally, he muttered, I don't know. Doesn't matter. Nobody cares what I want anyway. Naomi's face fell, but Reyes wasn't ready to let it go. It matters, he said firmly. It matters a lot. And I think you do know, Elijah. You're just too mad to say it out loud. I'm not mad, Elijah shot back, his voice sharp. I'm just tired. Tired of people looking at us like we don't belong. Like we're garbage. Naomi turned her face away, hiding her pain, but Reyes kept his gaze steady on Elijah through the mirror. You're right. There's a lot of unfairness out there. And the way those officers treated you today, that was wrong. I'm going to make sure they're held accountable. Elijah's eyes flickered with skepticism. And then what? They'll just find someone else to mess with. People like us don't get justice. The bitterness in Elijah's voice cut through the air, and for a moment, Reyes didn't respond. He let the words settle, let Elijah's anger speak for itself. Then, finally, he spoke, softly but with the weight of experience behind his words. Elijah, listen to me, Reyes said. I've been where you are, angry, hurting, and ready to fight the world. But you can't let that anger define you. You can't let it turn you into someone you're not. Elijah stared back at the window, his fists clenching once again. Easy for you to say, he muttered. You've got a job, a house. You're not out here like us. Reyes's voice remained calm, but insistent. You're right. I got those things now, but I didn't always. I grew up in a neighborhood not so different from this one. My family struggled. My mom worked 2 jobs, and some nights, there wasn't enough to eat. I was angry, too. I thought the world owed me something for the way it treated us. Elijah turned slightly, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. Reyes glanced at him briefly in the mirror before continuing. But I learned something important, Elijah. That anger? It can either push you to be better, or it can pull you down to the level of the people you're angry at. You have a choice. Be better than them. Prove them wrong. The car grew quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine. Naomi looked over at her son, hope flickering faintly in her eyes. Elijah, did you hear him? You can rise above this. I know you can. Elijah didn't answer. He stared at his hands, his mind a storm of emotions. A part of him didn't want to hear it, to admit that Reyes might be right. How could someone like him, with nothing, rise above anything? But another part of him, a small voice buried deep under all the anger, wanted to believe it. The patrol car slowed as they approached the shelter, a modest brick building tucked between rows of crumbling apartments. Reyes parked, turned off the engine, and turned to face them. This isn't much, he said quietly, but it's a start. You don't have to stay in this place forever. It gets better if you fight for it. Naomi offered him a faint, grateful smile. Thank you, Captain Reyes, for everything. Reyes nodded, then turned his gaze to Elijah. Kid, you've got something special in you. Don't waste it. Next time you think no one cares, remember that I do. Elijah looked up, his eyes locking with Reyes's for just a moment. He didn't say a word, but something in his expression softened, a crack in the hard wall he'd built around himself. Naomi and Elijah stepped out of the car, the grocery bag still cradled in her arms. As they walked toward the shelter, Captain Reyes watched them through the windshield. He couldn't fix everything for them. He knew that. But he could light a spark of hope in a boy who desperately needed it. And sometimes, he thought, that was enough to start a fire that could change everything. The narrow alley behind an abandoned warehouse in Willowbrook was cloaked in darkness. The faint flicker of a dying streetlight cast jagged shadows on the graffiti-covered walls, making the scene feel even more sinister. A crumpled flyer drifted lazily across the ground, caught in a soft gust of wind, and settled near the edge of a rusty dumpster. It was a place no one in their right mind would linger, especially after nightfall. But tonight, 3 figures huddled in that shadowy space, their voices low and charged with venom. Officer Brandt stood at the center, his broad frame leaning against the wall, a cigarette dangling loosely between his fingers. The red glow from its tip illuminated his sharp, angry features. To his left, Officer Tyler Vega, wiry and nervous, fidgeted with the sleeves of his jacket. He shifted on his feet, his eyes darting to the darkness beyond the alley as if expecting someone to jump out. Beside him, Officer Carla Keller stood with her arms crossed, her face cold and expressionless, though her sharp gaze betrayed a brewing storm beneath her calm exterior. "I still can't believe that sanctimonious bastard suspended us," Brant growled, his voice dripping with contempt as he flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "Captain Reyes thinks he can humiliate us? Strip us of our badges? Who the hell does he think he is?" "He's gonna regret it," Keller muttered, her voice low and dangerous. "He's made his move. Now it's our turn." Vega's gaze shot toward her, uneasy. "This is getting out of hand. I mean, yeah, the guy's a pain, but nothing," Brant snapped, cutting him off with a glare that could have frozen steel. "Reyes thinks he's untouchable, and we're going to remind him that no one makes fools out of us. He cost us our jobs, our pay, and our respect. So now we take something from him." Vega swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in the dim light. "What are you talking about?" Brant leaned forward, his voice lowering to an ominous whisper. "His family. We know where he lives. Quiet neighborhood. Nice house. No one's going to see it coming." Keller's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "We burn it while they're inside." The words hung heavy in the air, so while they seemed to pull all the warmth from the alley. Vega took a shaky step back, his voice quivering. "Are you crazy? You're talking about murder, burning his house down. What if someone dies?" "That's the point," Brant said darkly, his eyes glinting. "Reyes wants to act like a hero, fine. Let's see what he's willing to lose. Maybe next time he'll think twice before screwing us over." This is too much," Vega stammered, his face pale. "We could go to prison for this." Keller shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "You're in this as much as we are, Vega. You want out now? Fine. But don't think for a second we'll let you walk away." Vega froze, the threat hanging unspoken, but clear in Keller's cold gaze. He shifted uncomfortably, wringing his hands. "I'm not saying I'm out," he muttered, finally defeated. "But this is serious. We'll have to be careful." Brant smirked, satisfied. "Careful's the easy part. We do it late, after midnight. By then, they'll be asleep. Quiet, fast, and thorough." He turned to Keller. "You bring the gas. Vega, you're driving. Meet at my place at 11. The plan was set. Their voices dropped further into quiet, conspiratorial murmurs as they ironed out the details. None of them noticed the faint rustling sound coming from behind a row of battered trash bins across the alley. Pressed tightly against the cold, rusted metal of a dumpster, he tried to silence the pounding of his heart in his chest. He hadn't meant to be there. After leaving the shelter earlier that night, Elijah had wandered the streets, unable to shake the anger and helplessness still burning inside him. He'd hoped the quiet darkness of Willowbrook's backstreets would help clear his mind. Instead, he'd stumbled upon this. At first, he hadn't recognized the voices, but as he crouched behind the bins, his body tense and still, the conversation took a dark turn. When he heard Captain Reyes's name and his family, Elijah's blood ran cold. They're going to burn his house down. His mind raced, each thought more frantic than the last. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but the men's voices were clear, their intent unmistakable. And Captain Reyes, the man who had defended him and his mom earlier that day, was their target. Elijah's hands trembled as he fought the urge to run. "If they see me," but he couldn't just walk away. As much as he wanted to bolt down the alley and pretend he hadn't heard a thing, he knew he couldn't. If he did nothing, Reyes and his family could die. 11 tonight, Brant's voice echoed, sharp and final. Elijah peeked out, just enough to see the officers shake hands before dispersing. Brant and Keller strode confidently toward a battered pickup truck parked at the alley's entrance. Vega lingered a moment longer, his posture slouched and uncertain before following. Elijah waited. His legs cramped, his back ached. But he didn't dare move until the truck's engine rumbled to life and the alley fell silent once more. Slowly, he inched out from behind the bins, his breath shaky and uneven, the weight of what he'd just heard pressed down on him like a stone. As Elijah crept out of the alley and into the empty streets, his mind whirled with questions and fear. What should I do? Who's going to believe me? He was just a homeless kid after all. The police wouldn't listen to him. And if Brant and his crew found out he'd overheard them, the thought made his stomach twist. Elijah stopped walking and looked up at the empty sky, tears of frustration welling in his eyes. "Why me?" he whispered hoarsely to no one. But deep down, he already knew the answer. He'd been given this knowledge for a reason. Running away wouldn't stop what was going to happen. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he steeled himself. Captain Reyes had stood up for him and his mom. Now it was his turn to stand up for Reyes. "I have to warn him," Elijah muttered, his voice trembling but resolute. "I have to." And with that, he turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement as he disappeared into the night. Elijah's feet pounded against the cracked pavement as he sprinted through the darkened streets of Willowbrook. His lungs burned, and his heart thudded wildly in his chest, but he didn't slow down. Every time he blinked, the words he'd overheard echoed like a drumbeat in his head. "We burn it." While they're inside, the thought of Captain Reyes, of his family, trapped in a burning house while those officers watched from the shadows, sent chills down his spine. "I can't let that happen," he thought, his determination pushing him forward. When Elijah finally reached the shelter, the building loomed quietly under the soft glow of a nearby street lamp. He burst through the door, his sneakers squeaking loudly on the old tile floor, startling the few people still awake in the common room. The faint hum of a crackling television in the corner was silenced when a disheveled woman glanced up at him from her chair. "Boy, what's got into you?" she muttered sleepily. But Elijah didn't answer. He bolted toward the small room he shared with his mother. Inside, Naomi was sitting on the edge of the thin cot, her back hunched as she sewed a torn shirt by the dim light of a flickering bulb. The needle in her hand stilled when Elijah burst in, doubled over and gasping for breath. "Elijah?" Naomi's face tightened with concern as she stood quickly. "What happened? What's wrong?" "Mom." Elijah struggled to catch his breath, his voice raw. You won't believe what I heard." He sank to his knees, trying to steady himself, but the words tumbled out in a rush. "Those officers, the ones from today, they're going after Captain Reyes. They're going to burn his house down tonight with his family inside." Naomi's expression froze, her hands falling limply to her sides. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I heard them," Elijah said, his face flushed with desperation. "They were in the alley behind the old warehouse. Brant and the others. They're serious, Mom. They're going to do it." Naomi's eyes widened with shock and horror. She staggered slightly, reaching out to brace herself against the wall. "Oh, God," she murmured, as if trying to make sense of the words. She looked at Elijah with a mix of panic and fear. "You must have misunderstood, Elijah. They wouldn't. I didn't," Elijah shouted, his voice cracking. "I heard everything. They had a plan, gasoline, the time, everything. They're going to do it at midnight." Naomi moved toward him quickly, kneeling so she could grip his shoulders. "Elijah, stop. Stop. You need to listen to me." Her voice trembled, and tears glistened in her eyes. "You can't get involved in this. You hear me? Those men are dangerous. If they find out you overheard them, then what?" Elijah shot back, pulling away from her grip. "They'll hurt me? They already think we're nothing. But if I do nothing, Captain Reyes and his family will die." Naomi flinched as though struck. "Elijah, no," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's not your responsibility. This isn't our fight. Isn't it?" Elijah said, his voice rising with frustration. He paced the small room, his hands balled into fists. "He stood up for us, Mom. He stopped them from hurting you today. He didn't have to. He could have ignored us like everyone else, but he didn't. Now they're coming after him because he did the right thing." Elijah stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes shining with determination. "If I don't do something, then I'm no better than those guys." Naomi's lips trembled as she stared at him, her face etched with helplessness. She reached for him again, her voice soft and desperate. "Elijah, you're my son. You're all I have. If something happens to you—" "I know, Mom," Elijah said, his voice gentler now. He stepped forward and took her trembling hands in his own. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But someone has to stop them. If I don't tell Captain Reyes, no one will. Naomi shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. There has to be another way. There isn't. Elijah whispered firmly. I have to go to the precinct. I have to warn him. For a moment, Naomi said nothing, her sobs filling the quiet room. Finally, she wiped her tears and looked up at her son, seeing the resolute expression on his face. The same look his father had once worn when life had tested him. Promise me, she choked out. Promise me you'll be careful. Elijah nodded, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. I promise. Naomi pulled him into a tight embrace, holding on as if she could shield him from the dangers ahead. I love you, Elijah, she whispered, her voice thick with grief and pride. I love you too, Mom, Elijah replied softly. The night air was cold and sharp as Elijah stepped out of the shelter. The streets were empty, save for the occasional echo of a distant car or barking dog. His breath formed tiny clouds in front of him as he tightened his jacket and broke into a determined jog. He didn't have time to waste. Every second felt like a ticking clock in his mind. The police precinct wasn't far, but to Elijah, the distance felt endless. His sneakers slapped against the pavement, the sound echoing in the stillness. Each step carried the weight of what he was about to do. A nagging voice in his mind whispered doubts. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm lying? But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing only on Captain Reyes and his family. When the glowing sign of the Willowbrook Police Precinct finally came into view, Elijah felt a surge of relief. He sprinted toward the front doors, ignoring the stitch in his side and the burn in his legs. As he burst through the entrance, gasping for air, two officers at the front desk looked up in surprise. Hey, kid, what's the rush? One of them asked, his tone gruff but curious. Elijah staggered forward, gripping the edge of the counter. I need to speak to Captain Reyes, he wheezed. It's urgent. His life is in danger. The older officer narrowed his eyes, clearly skeptical. What are you talking about? Slow down. No time, Elijah blurted, his voice desperate. There are officers, bad ones, planning to burn down his house tonight. I heard them. Please, you have to believe me. The younger officer exchanged a wary glance with his partner. But something in Elijah's voice, his sheer desperation, made them pause. All right, kid, the younger one said, picking up the phone. Stay here. I'll call the captain. Elijah nodded, his chest heaving. He could only hope he wasn't too late. Elijah stood in the middle of the Willowbrook police station lobby, his chest heaving as if his lungs might collapse. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh white beams on the linoleum floor. Two officers at the front desk stared at him, their expressions torn between confusion and skepticism. To them, he was just a wiry street kid, disheveled clothes, dirt smudged on his cheeks, and panic written all over his face. Slow down, kid, the older officer, Sergeant Hughes, said gruffly. His salt and pepper mustache twitched with irritation as he leaned over the counter. What are you even talking about? Elijah's hands gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. I already told you, he panted, his voice rising with desperation. There's a group of bad cops. They're going after Captain Reyes. They're going to burn down his house tonight. You have to stop them. The second officer, a younger man named Officer Nolan, glanced at Hughes skeptically. You hear this, Sarge? Midnight arson plots? I mean, look at him. How does he even know where Reyes lives? Elijah whipped his head toward Nolan, his anger cutting through his fear. I heard them. I was in the alley near the old warehouse. They were planning it. They said they'd burn his house with his family inside. Gasoline, the time, everything. Hughes gave a long, tired sigh and folded his arms across his chest. Look, kid, you sound scared, and I get it. But you've got to understand, this is serious stuff you're saying. You don't just walk in here making wild accusations. I'm not lying, Elijah yelled, his voice cracking. Why would I lie about something like this? Captain Reyes is in danger, and you're wasting time. Hughes squinted at Elijah, studying him with an unreadable expression. Something about the boy, his desperation, His raw emotion made him hesitate. Still, Hughes had been a cop long enough to know that not every wild story panned out. You said you heard this in the alley? Did you see who it was? Do you even know their names? Yes, Elijah cried, seizing on the question. Brandt, Vega, and Keller. The names felt like lead in his mouth as he spoke them. They were there. I heard everything. The room fell silent for a beat. At the mention of the names, Hughes's posture shifted slightly. He exchanged a look with Nolan, a look that Elijah caught. It was small, but it was enough to give him hope. They knew something. Wait here, Hughes said sharply, pulling his radio from his belt and stepping away. He spoke into it in hushed tones, too quiet for Elijah to hear. Nolan stayed behind, eyeing Elijah with suspicion. You've got a lot of nerve, kid, Nolan muttered, making accusations against fellow officers. Elijah glared at him. I don't care what you think of me. If you don't listen, people are going to die. Before Nolan could respond, Hughes returned, his expression more serious than before. All right, kid, come with me. Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned. What? Captain Reyes isn't here. He's already gone home for the night. But I've radioed him, and he wants to hear what you've got to say. We're going to call him now. You'd better tell him everything, and I mean everything. Hughes's tone left no room for argument. Elijah nodded fiercely and followed Hughes into a small side office. The room was cramped and dimly lit, filled with old filing cabinets and a cluttered desk. Hughes picked up the landline phone, punched in a number, and waited. After a few rings, Captain Reyes's deep, steady voice came through the speaker. This is Reyes. Captain, Hughes said, his tone firm but respectful. I've got a boy here. Says he overheard something you'll want to hear about. It's urgent. Put him on. Reyes replied immediately, his voice sharpening. Hughes handed Elijah the phone. Elijah's palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the receiver. See Captain Reyes? He stammered, his throat dry. I'm here, son, Reyes said, his voice calmer now. Take a deep breath and tell me what's going on. Elijah closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself. It's those officers, Captain Brandt, Vega, Keller. I heard them tonight. They're planning to burn your house down. At midnight. They talked about gasoline, about making sure you and your family were inside. There was silence on the line. For a moment, Elijah's heart plummeted. What if he doesn't believe me? But then Reyes's voice came through, low and resolute. You're sure about this? Yes, sir, Elijah said. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Good, Reyes replied. There was a quiet edge to his voice now, a steeliness Elijah recognized from earlier that day. You did the right thing coming forward, Elijah. I need you to stay at the station where it's safe. I'll handle this. Elijah's shoulders sagged with relief, but he straightened again, his resolve flaring. Captain, please. I want to help. I can't just sit here and do nothing. Listen to me, Reyes said firmly. You've done more than enough. You gave us what we needed. Now it's my turn to keep my family and you safe. Elijah hesitated, but finally nodded. Okay, he murmured. Just please stop them. I will, Reyes promised. Hughes, keep the boy at the station. I'll call in backup and head home now. Yes, sir, Hughes replied, hanging up the phone. Meanwhile, Captain Reyes's SUV roared down the quiet streets of Willowbrook, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His thoughts raced as he dialed his wife, Sophie. Pack up the kids, and I'll take our family to a safe place. Right now, he ordered. Marcus, what's going on? Sophie's worried voice came through. I can't explain yet, Reyes said. Just trust me. I'll meet you at home. As Reyes sped toward his home, he radioed trusted officers, detailing his plan. We'll make it look like we're home, he said. Set a trap. We'll let them think they're walking into their perfect crime. Back at the precinct, Elijah sat on the edge of a chair, chewing the skin on his thumb nervously as the clock on the wall ticked. Every minute felt like an eternity. In his mind, he imagined Reyes's house, imagined the gasoline and the fire. Please make it in time, he thought, clenching his fists. And as the night stretched on, he hoped, desperately, that warning Captain Reyes would be enough. The night was unnervingly quiet as Captain Marcus Reyes pulled his SUV to a stop in front of his home. The house sat still and dark, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac where every neighbor was already fast asleep. Marcus sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind replayed Elijah's warning like a broken record. They're going to burn your house down. At midnight, Reyes exhaled sharply, snapping himself back to the moment. His family was safe. That was the important part. Hours earlier, he'd rushed Sophie and the kids out of the house, instructing them to pack only essentials. With no time to explain, he'd driven them to a secure, safe house, a location managed by the Department for Emergencies. Sophie had been frightened, but didn't press for details. She trusted him, and that trust gave Reyes the clarity he needed to move forward. Now, all that remained was the plan, a decoy to draw Brandt, Vega, and Keller into a trap. Inside the dimly lit police precinct, Elijah fidgeted on a chair in the corner of the office where he'd been left under Officer Hughes's watchful eye. He chewed nervously at his fingernails, his mind racing. He imagined Reyes's house. Imagined the shadows creeping closer with gas cans and lighters in hand. It was a nightmare on repeat. "I need to go," Elijah blurted suddenly, sitting up straight. Hughes, who was pouring himself a cup of stale coffee, shot him a sharp look. "Go where, kid? You're staying here where it's safe." Captain Reyes's orders. "No," Elijah insisted, jumping to his feet. "I can help. I heard them. I know what they sound like, and I know what they'll say. I can prove it if I'm there. You need someone watching. Please, let me help." Hughes sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "You don't get it, kid. This isn't some game you get to play hero in. It's dangerous out there." Elijah clenched his fists, his voice steady despite the tremble in it. "I'm not trying to play hero. I owe him. Captain Reyes helped us when no one else did. I can't just sit here and do nothing." Hughes stared at him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. The kid had guts, he couldn't deny that. Finally, with a reluctant grunt, Hughes picked up the phone and made a call. Less than an hour later, Elijah crouched behind the hedge of an old neighbor's property across from Captain Reyes's house. His thin jacket barely shielded him from the cold night air, and his breath puffed out in pale clouds as he exhaled. In his hands, he gripped a small black recording device, the buttons illuminated faintly under the moonlight. Officer Hughes had handed it to him before they'd set out, grumbling instructions under his breath. "You press this here to record. You don't leave this spot. You don't make noise. And you don't get seen. You hear me, kid?" "I hear you," Elijah had promised, his heart pounding. Now, crouched in the darkness, Elijah's ears strained for any sound. The street was deathly quiet, the houses bathed in deep shadow. From his vantage point, he could see Reyes's home, completely dark except for a single faint light glowing in an upstairs window, placed intentionally as part of the decoy. The captain's SUV sat parked in the driveway, completing the illusion that the family was inside. Somewhere out of sight, Reyes and a team of trusted officers were lying in wait, concealed in surrounding yards, bushes, and parked vehicles. They were watching, silent and patient, ready to spring into action the moment the rogue officers appeared. Elijah's heart raced as he adjusted his position, keeping the recorder clutched tight. He felt his pulse in his ears, the quiet thud matching the ticking clock in his mind. Midnight was drawing closer. "Please let this work," he thought. The sound came softly at first, a faint rumble of an approaching engine. Elijah froze, his eyes snapping toward the distant end of the street. A battered pickup truck rounded the corner, its headlights extinguished as it crept forward like a predator stalking prey. Elijah's stomach twisted as he recognized the truck. It was the same one he'd seen in the alley earlier that night. He instinctively ducked lower, his fingers trembling as he hit the record button on the device. The truck slowed to a stop a few houses down, just outside of the glow of a nearby streetlight. 3 figures climbed out of the cab, their shapes emerging like shadows. Elijah strained to see, and even from a distance, he could make out their outlines. Brandt, the broad-shouldered ringleader, Keller, tall and sharp, and Vega, the wiry figure dragging his feet. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to run, to bury his face and pretend this wasn't happening. but he forced himself to stay still. "You can do this," he told himself. "Keep it quiet," Brant muttered harshly, his voice carrying just far enough for Elijah to hear. "We don't want anyone waking up." From the back of the truck, Keller hauled out 2 large gasoline cans, their metal clinking softly. Vega followed, holding a crowbar in one hand and a lighter in the other. Elijah's stomach churned at the sight. "Vega, take the side gate," Brant ordered, his voice low and cold. "Keller, start on the porch. I'll handle the garage." Elijah pressed the recorder closer to his mouth and whispered softly into it, hoping the microphone would catch his words. "They're here. I see them. Brant's leading them. He's got gas. Keller's at the porch. Vega's going to the gate." His voice was shaking, but he kept going, whispering everything he saw. Across the street, the rogue officers moved with chilling purpose, their boots making dull thuds against the pavement. Elijah's heart pounded harder as Keller approached the front steps of Reyes's house, unscrewing the cap of the gasoline can. She glanced over her shoulder once, scanning the street, and for a terrible second, Elijah thought she'd seen him. But she turned back to her task, tipping the can to pour a dark line of liquid across the wooden porch. Elijah's chest tightened. "Come on, Captain," he thought desperately. "Now, please." The moment Captain Marcus Reyes's sharp whistle split through the still night air, the street erupted into chaos. Bright floodlights flared on from the shadows, spilling white light across the cul-de-sac and illuminating the rogue officers as if they were caught under a spotlight. Brant, Keller, and Vega froze in place, their shocked expressions flickering from confusion to fear as the sudden ambush unfolded around them. "Police! Drop everything! Hands in the air! Now!" Captain Reyes's voice boomed, firm and unyielding, as officers emerged from their hiding spots, guns drawn, eyes locked on their targets. Keller, crouched on the porch with the gasoline can still tilted in her hand, cursed under her breath as the can fell, clattering against the wooden steps and spilling its pungent liquid onto the ground. She raised her hands slowly, her sharp eyes scanning for a way out. Vega, already near the side gate, dropped his crowbar and turned to run, his sneakers scraping against the pavement. "No, no, no," he muttered, panic overtaking him. But it was too late. 2 officers tackled him before he could take more than a step, pinning him to the grass. "Don't move," one of them barked, yanking Vega's hands behind his back and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Brant, standing in the center of the yard, seethed with rage. His hands slowly rose above his head, but his glare burned straight through Captain Reyes as the officer advanced toward him. "You set us up," Brant hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this changes anything? You think you win?" Reyes ignored him, his face hard as stone. "You've lost, Brant," he said coolly. "It's over." "Like hell it is," Brant spat, but he didn't resist as officers swarmed him, his arms forced behind his back and cuffs locking into place. Hidden behind the hedge across the street, Elijah watched the entire scene unfold, his chest heaving with a mixture of adrenaline and relief. His small hands gripped the recording device tightly, its red light still glowing to indicate it was capturing everything. The officers' furious protests and curses rang in Elijah's ears as they were subdued and cuffed one by one. "It's working," he thought, his heart pounding. "We stopped them." He glanced up just in time to see Captain Reyes striding across the lawn toward Keller, whose face had finally cracked, her composure slipping. "You've got nothing," she sneered. "This is just a misunderstanding." Reyes tilted his head, his calm confidence unshakable. "A misunderstanding?" He reached for the small radio clipped to his shoulder and signaled. "Hughes, bring the boy over." Elijah froze as he heard his name. A moment later, he saw Officer Hughes step out of the shadows and wave him forward. Elijah hesitated for half a second, his heart thudding in his chest, but he quickly stood up. This was his moment, the moment to prove that all of this had been worth it. "Come on, kid," Hughes muttered, his voice quieter than usual as he led Elijah across the street. "You did good tonight." Elijah followed closely, the recording device clutched tightly in his hand. As they approached, Keller's eyes flickered toward him, narrowing with cold recognition. Brant turned his head as well, his lip curling into a sneer. "The street kid," he said, almost laughing. "You put your trust in him?" Captain Reyes didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he turned to Elijah, his voice steady. "You still have the recording?" Elijah nodded, holding out the device with both hands like it was made of glass. "It's all here," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Everything they said. I recorded it." Reyes gave Elijah a nod of approval before holding up the small device. "Sergeant Hughes, get this to evidence. Now!" Hughes took the recorder and stepped back, already calling into his radio to alert the precinct. As he disappeared, Reyes turned his attention back to the three rogue officers, who were now lined up on the grass, their hands cuffed and their faces clouded with fury. "You wanted to play with fire," Reyes said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "But you forgot who you were up against. You forgot that the badge means something. You forgot that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right." Brant's glare burned brighter, but he said nothing. Elijah stepped back as officers began loading Brant, Keller, and Vega into waiting squad cars. He felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, though his legs still shook with the remnants of fear. He couldn't stop staring at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights, the handcuffed officers, and the gasoline can still tipped on the porch like a forgotten relic. "You did good, Elijah," a voice said beside him. Elijah turned to find Captain Reyes standing next to him, his strong presence offering a strange sense of calm. "If it weren't for you," Reyes continued, "my family, my kids," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I owe you everything." Elijah swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let them do it. I couldn't let them hurt you." Reyes rested a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. "Not many people would have done what you did tonight. You were brave, Elijah. And because of you, those officers will never hurt anyone again." Elijah looked up at Reyes, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Do you think they'll believe me? I mean, in court?" "They'll believe you," Reyes said confidently. "With the recording and everything you've seen, there's no way they can deny it. You just saved my family and stopped something terrible from happening." Elijah's eyes darted back to the squad cars, where Brant was glaring out the window as officers slammed the door shut. For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt like he'd made a difference, like his voice, so often ignored, had finally been heard. Reyes gave his shoulder one last pat. "Let's get you back to the station. You've done enough for tonight." Elijah nodded and followed Reyes to his SUV. As they drove away, the flashing lights in the rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely. Elijah leaned back in the seat, letting out a long, shaky breath. For so long, he believed that the world was a place where no one cared, where people like him and his mom were invisible. But tonight, he'd proven something to himself. He could make a difference. Even a street kid had the power to stand up and do what was right. And as the quiet hum of the engine carried them down the empty streets, Elijah allowed himself a small smile, knowing that tonight, justice had won. The city of Willowbrook was buzzing with tension and outrage. News of the rogue officer's betrayal had spread like wildfire. The morning headlines screamed of corruption and conspiracy. 3 officers charged in plot to kill police captain and family. It was a story that shook the community to its core. Those sworn to protect had plotted to destroy. In every corner of the city, conversations hummed with shock and anger. For residents of Willowbrook who had already lost trust in the system, it was a cruel confirmation of their worst fears. For others, it was an awakening, a realization that corruption could hide behind polished badges. But amid the outrage, whispers of hope emerged. The truth came out. Justice is being served. The courthouse was packed on the day of the trial. The air inside the building felt heavy, charged with the weight of what was at stake. Reporters lined the hallways, their cameras clicking furiously as the defendants, Brant, Keller, and Vega, were escorted inside in orange prison jumpsuits, their wrists shackled. Brant's once smug demeanor had hardened into a cold, defiant mask. Keller walked with her head held high, her expression blank, though her sharp eyes darted around the room as if calculating her next move. Vega, on the other hand, seemed smaller than before, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the floor. Captain Marcus Reyes sat at the front of the courtroom, his uniform crisp and his face unreadable. Next to him sat his wife, Sophie, her hand resting firmly on his, while their two young children were home safe with relatives. Behind Reyes, a sea of fellow officers and community members filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. And near the back of the room, sitting next to his mother Naomi, was Elijah. Elijah fidgeted with his hands, his small frame dwarfed by the large courtroom. Naomi squeezed his arm gently, her expression full of quiet encouragement. "You're going to be fine, Elijah," she whispered. "You've already done so much. You're stronger than you know." Elijah swallowed hard and nodded, though his stomach twisted into nervous knots. He knew what today meant. His testimony was crucial. His voice, the voice of a kid who had so often been ignored, would be the key to locking the rogue officers behind bars. The trial began with a somber opening statement from the prosecution. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Myers, wasted no time addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, "this case is not just about arson or conspiracy. This is about betrayal. It is about three individuals who chose to abuse their power and their badge. Individuals who plotted to harm a man who stood for justice, along with his innocent family. This is about trust broken and justice restored." Her words echoed through the courtroom, sending ripples of unease through the crowd. The defense, led by a visibly strained lawyer representing Brandt, tried to counter. "This was nothing more than a misunderstanding," the lawyer argued. "There was no real intent to harm. People say things in frustration that they don't mean. My clients were suspended unfairly and vented their anger. That's all this was." But as the evidence began to unfold, it quickly became clear that the defense's arguments were little more than smoke and mirrors. The prosecution presented Elijah's recording first. The courtroom fell silent as the damning audio played over the speakers. Brandt's voice growled in the recording. "We burn it while they're inside." Keller's cold agreement followed. "By the time anyone notices, it'll be too late." And then Vega's nervous voice. "We do it after midnight. Quiet, fast, thorough." The words cut through the room like a knife. Brandt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening, while Keller stared straight ahead, her face stone cold. Vega wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. When the recording ended, Helen Myers addressed the jury. "This recording makes it abundantly clear. There was no misunderstanding. This was premeditated, intentional, a plan to destroy lives." The pivotal moment came when Elijah was called to the stand. "Elijah Carter," the bailiff announced, and all eyes turned to him as he stood. Elijah's legs felt shaky as he walked to the witness box, but he straightened his back and focused on what he needed to do. Naomi's encouraging smile followed him every step of the way. Captain Reyes gave him a small, proud nod. Once seated, Elijah faced Helen Myers, who approached with a reassuring expression. "Elijah, can you tell the court what happened the night you overheard the defendant's conversation?" Elijah nodded, his voice quiet but steady as he began. "I was walking through the alley near the old warehouse, and I heard them. Brandt, Keller, and Vega. They were talking about Captain Reyes, about burning his house while his family was sleeping. They had gasoline, lighters, and a plan." "And why did you decide to come forward?" Myers asked. Elijah glanced at Reyes, then back at the jury. "Because it was wrong. Captain Reyes stood up for me and my mom when no one else would. I couldn't let those men hurt him." The defense lawyer stepped forward for cross-examination. "Elijah," he said, his voice dripping with doubt, "you're a homeless kid, aren't you? How do we know you didn't make this up for attention?" Elijah's fists clenched under the stand, but he looked the lawyer straight in the eyes. "I didn't make anything up," he said firmly. "Everything I said is true. I'm not lying." The lawyer faltered at Elijah's steady resolve, and murmurs swept through the courtroom. Elijah's words carried weight. He had been dismissed and doubted his whole life, but not this time. This time they listened. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to read the verdict. on the charges of conspiracy to commit arson and attempted murder. We find the defendants guilty. The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. Brandt's face twisted with fury. Keller's mask of indifference finally cracked, and Vegas slumped in defeat. The judge delivered the sentencing swiftly, condemning all three to lengthy prison terms. Your betrayal of the badge and your community is unforgivable, the judge declared. Justice demands that you face the consequences of your actions. Captain Reyes turned to Elijah in the gallery, his face full of gratitude. Naomi gripped her son's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed Reyes, but he held up a hand. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about a young man who had the courage to do the right thing." Elijah, standing beside his mother, looked up at Reyes with awe. For the first time in his life, he felt seen, not as a homeless kid, not as a nobody, but as someone who mattered. Justice had been served, and Elijah Carter had played a part in making it happen. The crisp morning sunlight bathed Willowbrook's Central Plaza in a golden glow. Rows of folding chairs lined the space, filled with police officers, city officials, reporters, and curious townsfolk. The flag of the Willowbrook Police Department fluttered in the gentle breeze, positioned proudly beside a wooden stage where a podium and microphone awaited. It was a day of celebration, a stark contrast to the tension of the past weeks. The trial of the rogue officers had shaken the community, but the outcome brought hope and relief. Today wasn't about corruption. It was about courage. And standing at the center of it all was a boy no one had seen coming, Elijah Carter. Elijah stood nervously behind the stage with his mother, Naomi. He fidgeted with the sleeves of the new jacket someone at the precinct had given him, its fabric crisp and unfamiliar. Naomi placed a calming hand on his shoulder, smiling through tears of pride. "You're going to do great, sweetheart," she whispered. Elijah glanced toward the crowd, his stomach twisting. Dozens of people had come to see this moment, his moment, and the sight of so many eyes made his palms slick with sweat. "Why are there so many people?" he muttered, his voice low. Naomi gave a soft laugh, brushing his hair back affectionately. "Because you deserve to be seen, Elijah. You've earned this." Before he could respond, a familiar figure approached. Captain Marcus Reyes, dressed in full uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming in the sunlight. His imposing presence was tempered by the warm smile he offered. "You ready, Elijah?" Reyes asked, his voice steady but kind. Elijah looked up at the captain and nodded hesitantly. "I think so." Reyes crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "You don't have to say anything fancy up there. Just speak from the heart, and the rest will come naturally. Today is about what you did, and who you are." Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat and straightened his shoulders. "Okay," he said, this time with a bit more confidence. Reyes clapped him gently on the shoulder and turned toward the podium as the ceremony began. The crowd quieted as Captain Reyes stepped up to the microphone. His voice, firm and clear, carried across the plaza. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping over the audience, "we are gathered here today to honor an act of extraordinary bravery. Bravery not from an officer or a soldier, but from a young man who, when faced with a dangerous choice, decided to stand up for what was right." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. "Elijah Carter," Reyes continued, gesturing toward the boy, "is the reason my family and I are standing here today. His courage, his quick thinking, and his unwavering sense of justice stopped a terrible crime and exposed a betrayal that would have otherwise gone unpunished. Despite having every reason to walk away, fear, doubt, and the risk to his own safety, Elijah chose to act. That is true courage." Elijah shifted nervously as all eyes turned toward him. Naomi squeezed his hand reassuringly. Captain Reyes picked up a small velvet box resting on the podium and opened it to reveal a gleaming medal hanging from a blue ribbon. "Today, on behalf of the Willowbrook Police Department, it is my honor to present Elijah Carter with the Medal of Courage, a recognition of his bravery and selflessness." Applause erupted as Reyes stepped back and gestured for Elijah to join him on stage. Elijah's legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds as he walked up, the sound of clapping echoing in his ears. But when he looked out into the crowd, his eyes landed on his mother's tearful smile and the proud nod from Captain Reyes. That was all he needed. Reyes lowered the medal over Elijah's neck and patted his shoulder once again. The captain leaned in briefly and said quietly, "You earned this, kid." Elijah took a shaky breath as Reyes motioned for him to speak. He stepped up to the microphone, staring at the sea of faces before him. His heart pounded, but after a moment his voice emerged steady and clear. "I don't really know what to say," Elijah began, his words honest and raw. "I didn't do this because I wanted an award. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The crowd hushed, captivated by the boy's sincerity. "I've spent a lot of my life feeling invisible," Elijah admitted, glancing at his mother briefly. "People look at us, people like me and my mom, and they think we don't matter. But Captain Reyes showed me that standing up for what's right, that matters more than anything." He paused, taking another breath. "I want to thank my mom for always believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And I want to thank Captain Reyes for showing me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do the right thing anyway." The applause that followed was deafening. Naomi wiped tears from her face as she watched her son, her brave son, stand tall on that stage. After the ceremony, a woman in a sharp navy blue suit approached Elijah and his mother. She introduced herself as Claire Thompson, the director of the New Horizons Foundation, a nonprofit that helped families get back on their feet. "Elijah, your story has touched so many people," Claire said warmly. "We want to help you and your mother start fresh. Our foundation will provide you with a safe place to live, financial support, and help for your mom to find steady employment. And we'll make sure you have the resources you need to go to school." Naomi gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. You're serious?" "Very," Claire said with a smile. "You both deserve this." Elijah stared at her, speechless. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of survival beginning to lift. Captain Reyes approached them then, his expression full of pride. "Looks like things are turning around for you too." Naomi turned to him, tears streaming as she clasped his hand tightly. "Thank you, Captain Reyes, for everything." Reyes looked at Elijah. "Don't thank me. Your son's the hero here." Elijah ducked his head shyly, but for once, he allowed himself to smile, a real, hopeful smile. The future no longer seemed like an impossible dream. It was within reach, and he would fight to make the most of it. As the crowd began to disperse, Captain Reyes clapped Elijah on the back one last time. "Keep that courage, Elijah. The world needs people like you." Elijah nodded, determination gleaming in his eyes. "I will, Captain. I promise." And as he walked away, hand in hand with his mother, Elijah Carter finally believed that their lives were about to change, because he had proved, once and for all, that standing up for what's right could make all the difference. The warm spring air buzzed with excitement as the sun rose over Willowbrook Police Academy's sprawling campus. Rows of proud graduates stood tall in their crisp uniforms, their polished badges gleaming as family and friends gathered on the sidelines. Today was not just a ceremony. It was a symbol of transformation, a bridge between the trials of the past and the promise of the future. Among those graduates stood Elijah Carter, taller, stronger, and radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place. At 21 years old, Elijah was no longer the scared, angry boy who had once felt invisible. His sharp uniform fit perfectly, and the academy crest on his shoulder gleamed like a beacon of hope. From his place in line, Elijah looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning until they settled on a familiar face near the front. Captain Marcus Reyes, standing with arms crossed, his face a mixture of pride and quiet reflection. Next to Reyes sat Elijah's mother, Naomi, beaming with tears already glistening in her eyes. This moment was as much hers as it was Elijah's. The ceremony began with the academy director delivering words of encouragement and responsibility to the graduating class. "Wearing this badge is not just a privilege. It is a promise," the director declared. "A promise to uphold justice, to serve with honor, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Elijah's mind drifted as the speech echoed around him. He thought back to that dark night years ago, crouched behind the bushes with a recording device in his trembling hands. He thought of the fear that had gripped him, of the choice he'd made to act when everything inside him had told him to run. That moment had changed everything. A voice broke through his thoughts. Elijah Carter. His name rang out across the courtyard, clear and powerful. Elijah's chest tightened as he stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the stage. The crowd erupted into applause. But the noise faded into the background as his gaze met Captain Reyes's. Waiting for him at the center of the stage was Reyes, now promoted to deputy chief, his uniform adorned with insignias marking decades of service. But none of those honors mattered as much to Reyes as what he was about to do. In his hands, he held the badge Elijah had worked so hard to earn. As Elijah approached, Reyes gave him a proud smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "You've come a long way, Elijah," Reyes said quietly, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You earned this moment." Elijah stood tall as Reyes pinned the badge to his chest, the weight of it grounding him. The applause swelled. But all Elijah could hear was the pounding of his heart. The badge wasn't just metal and leather. It was everything. A symbol of redemption, second chances, and the promise he had made to himself and to others. Reyes stepped back slightly, but didn't move far. He gripped Elijah's shoulder firmly, looking him in the eye. "I remember the first time we met," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the crowd to hear. "You were scared, angry, and convinced the world didn't care. But you showed me something rare that day, courage." Elijah's throat tightened as Reyes continued. "Courage isn't about being unafraid," Reyes said, repeating words Elijah had carried with him for years. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. And you've done that, Elijah. Time and time again." Reyes's voice softened, almost as though he were speaking just to him. "I am so proud of you, son." Elijah blinked, swallowing hard to keep the tears at bay. In that moment, the world seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them, mentor and mentee, bound by years of trust, growth, and quiet understanding. "Thank you, sir," Elijah said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I won't let you down." Reyes smiled warmly. "I know you won't." As the ceremony concluded and graduates were embraced by family and friends, Elijah stepped off the stage and was immediately swept into his mother's arms. "I'm so proud of you, Elijah," Naomi whispered, her tears soaking into his uniform. "You've become everything I always knew you could be." Elijah hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of all they had overcome. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Behind them, Reyes approached, a familiar presence that felt more like family than anything else. Naomi stepped back, wiping her tears as Reyes clapped Elijah on the shoulder. "You ready for what's next?" Reyes asked, his tone teasing but serious. Elijah nodded, his face resolute. "More than ready, sir." Reyes tilted his head slightly. "So, what's the plan, Officer Carter?" Elijah's face broke into a confident smile. "To help people, to stand up for the ones no one sees, just like you did for me." Reyes's smile widened. "That's the answer I was hoping for." As Elijah and Reyes walked across the courtyard side by side, Elijah looked around at the other officers and the families cheering them on. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the moments when his future seemed impossible. And he thought about all the kids out there, kids just like him, who felt invisible and unheard. Reyes seemed to sense what he was thinking. "You're going to be a great officer, Elijah. The kind the world needs more of." Elijah turned to him, his face calm but determined. "I'll make sure no one feels like I did, sir. I promise." Reyes nodded, a rare softness in his expression. "Good. Because it's people like you who change the world." Elijah's journey wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption and the power of choice. At every turn, he had the option to give in to anger, to let the weight of his circumstances hold him down. But he didn't. Elijah proved that one act of courage, no matter how small, can ripple outward and change lives. Not just for others, but for yourself. Captain Reyes's role in Elijah's life wasn't just about protection. It was about mentorship, about believing in someone who had forgotten how to believe in themselves. And in that belief, a young boy was given the chance to rise. The story of Elijah Carter reminds us all that heroes aren't born. They're made. They're forged in moments of fear, uncertainty, and impossible choices. And they're the ones who stand tall, not because they're unafraid, but because they know what's right. As Elijah pinned his badge proudly to his chest that day, one lesson remained clear. Courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss more inspiring and heartfelt stories like this one. Your support means everything to us.